So Bob, I want to talk about how someone can go full-time, should go full-time beekeeping. And there's some context around this. A lot of people try to put labels on, well, this many hives makes you a hobbyist, this many hives makes you a sideliner, this many hives makes you commercial. I think that's a lot of nonsense. I don't think you can do it that way. So I want to start out with a couple of quotes. This is from R.O.B. Manley. He was a British beekeeper. He wrote Honey Farming, a good book. He's a really good writer. Whether you agree or disagree with everything he writes, he's a very well-spoken man. Wrote this in right around 1945, the hottest part of World War II. So he says, one thing is certain, granted good management, the larger the business, the lower the capital required per unit, and the more economically the whole thing can be run. I do not think anyone should attempt to gain a livelihood from a bee farm of less than 200 colonies, and that being in all probability about the very smallest to be relied upon. It follows that it is also the least profitable. Granted the necessary capital, a man with 500 or 1,000 stocks is in an incomparably stronger position than a small man. And quote number 2, it is very doubtful indeed whether it is at all safe for any man to attempt to live by a one-man bee farm. My considered opinion is that bee farming is a job for 2 or 3 persons, which means that it is safe only when large enough to justify the employment of assistants.
Well, there's some truth in that, but not entirely. I have a friend in Asheville, North Carolina. You probably know who I'm going to bring.
I met Greg Rogers at
He's got 325, 340 colonies. He's doing fine. But he does it by himself. And occasionally he'll get some help if he's, having to lift something heavy or do something, or maybe pulling his honey crop, he'll get a little help for that. But he's been doing that for 40 years or 30 years, I forget. It might be 40. And he's very successful. So there's a good example of someone making a decent living off of, less than 400 colonies. I kind of agree with the statement there, at least 200. And of course it depends. Everything in beekeeping has an equation, and this is certainly a good example of that. It depends on what you're doing with the bees. 200 might be the right number if you're making lots of candles and making lots of soap and doing all these value-added products. But if you're not doing all of that, 500 may be the number you need to make money. When I was running bees by myself, no help, about, I guess this would have been about 20 years ago, there was a couple of years when I didn't have my sons helping me. I had nobody else helping me, no employees. And I ran my outfit up to 700 colonies. And I did it. I had excellent bees. I pulled it off. I almost made myself sick doing it. I was overworking myself, and I was still younger then, and I could take it. 700 was just too much. And I backed it down to 500, and suddenly it became comfortable and doable. I wasn't killing myself doing it. I was working very, very, very hard, but I wasn't killing myself. So there has to be a limit. And that statement about, what number makes you a sideliner or a commercial or any of that, you're right. It has to do with this equation we're talking about. Those numbers are highly variable. And it's just a generalization. The books have to say something, right?
Yeah.
Give people a general idea. Traditionally, 50 to 300 has been considered a sideliner. 300 and up is commercial, and under 50 you're a hobbyist. Well, at 50 colonies, I don't think you're a hobbyist anymore. I think you're way past that. At 20 or 30, you've gone past a hobby. You're into sidelining with it. You're making money. You have to be serious about it. It ain't no joke anymore. 30 colonies can be a lot of work. So it just depends on you and what you're trying to do with that. But let's pick on his statement about how you get bigger, it gets better. I believe that's actually correct, because we mentioned in a earlier video that as a colony doubles in size, the efficiency of the colony becomes 2.5 times more efficient. Mm-hmm. I think a crew of human beings experiences the same type of thing. Let's look at a construction crew building a house, for instance. If you've got one man building a house, and you compare it to 5 people building a house, the 5 people are going to do it more than 5 times quicker. It might be 6, 7, 8 times quicker. So I agree with that statement. Getting a little bigger where you can have a few employees, I think that's absolutely correct.
I've always heard the statement that 2 men can do the work of 4 working by themselves.
Yeah.
Especially if they get used to working with each other and they know what everybody is doing.
Fred Rossman made a fun personal statement to me once. We were talking about this very subject, and he says, "You know why it worked so good for me when I was in the bee yard?" He said, "When you have employees on site, you're motivated to keep rolling. You don't go sit down all the time and take a break and get on the phone. You want to stay there and keep the outfit rolling because that means money."
Yeah.
And he said that was what made him more efficient personally, was by having employees on site.
The number of colonies that a beekeeper can feasibly operate can be estimated by multiplying the number of hives that can be manipulated per working day times the days between required visits. This will give the maximum number of colonies per beekeeper. For example, if a beekeeper can examine 100 colonies per day, including travel time, and the colonies are re-examined at approximately 10-day to 2-week intervals, then 1,000 colonies is the maximum per beekeeper. This figure doesn't include rain delays or sickness. I think this may be where Ian Stepler gets his 10-day rule. Either he arrived at that independently, or maybe it's printed somewhere else, but that's a 10-day rule. Like, one beekeeper can only get through 100 hives in a day, therefore the maximum a beekeeper could keep is 1,000 colonies.
Is he saying he wants to see every beehive every 10 days?
To be able to get through every beehive every 10 days.
Well, good management would probably make the case for that. There are times when we don't see beehives for weeks.
Yeah.
But I know what they're up to. And of course he's so intense in his summer operation there. He'd have to see him every 10 days to super or do whatever, or to recognize a failing colony. Here we have a little more leniency. We can get by with 2 or 3 weeks often here in the on season.
Yeah.
But we know what they're up to. We know what we did last. We try to look ahead and set a colony up. And it's tricky. You try to set a colony up so it's not going to swarm, knowing you're not going to come back for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So and Mother Nature can throw a wrench into the mix. So we tend to oversplit, undersize a colony going into the honey flow to compensate for that. But in his situation, he's only got that short, intense window, so he really has to pay close attention.
To go full time, year-round full-time, and there's a distinction here. Like, you can be bivocational.
Sure.
You can if beekeeping is your main gig, and then you've got a side hustle or something that you do in the off season, that's a viable path as well, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, it's not. When I was very young, I was 14, I went to work for a landscaper, and he was a school teacher. In the time of year when school was in, we worked part-time. We'd work 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. We'd work a full day on Saturday, and that was it. And as soon as school was out, he took on all of these jobs. So, beekeeping's not exactly like that, because, you can't wait for certain chores with the bees. You have to be on time, but it can be that way.
Yeah, sure can. I've known a lot of firemen who ran lawn care businesses.
Yeah,
because they'll work 2 days on, 2 days off, or whatever, and I think that would work well. Someone who preaches on the weekends, you could do that. Someone who dabbles in rental real estate or is a handyman or something like that. I think there's a lot of opportunities there where people could get more diversified in their income stream, stay busy year-round, but make bees a bigger part of it.
Well, you can even do that within your own bee outfit. You can spend the summer doing things like making candles and soap for Christmas gifts. Mm-hmm. There's 2 ways of selling, well, there's several ways of selling honey, but basically you can produce honey, put it in a drum, and put it on a semi-truck and get it out of there. The other way is to jar it. Maybe have value-added products that come from your honey. Maybe you're infusing it. Maybe you're making creamed honey, which can be done in the winter and stocked for using in the summer. You can create winter work with a small outfit.
So How many hives do you think it takes before you need to bring in a part-time employee?
Well, I'd say over 500. You need to start thinking about it. Just my early statement, 700 was just too much for me. When I have two sons, you know that, and when they were young, they were both different ages. So one helped me for 4 years, and he was gone, and then the other one started helping me. So I always had one of them for about a 10-year period there. And that's when I would run up to 700 or 800 colonies with the help of a teenage boy that would help me after school or on Saturdays. And they were good at extracting, they were good at frame building, and that's how I utilized their time a lot. And I could run 700 or 800 colonies like that.
How many colonies do you think you need to support a full-time year-round employee?
You could do it with 500 if you had a lot of these other avenues of income that you've got
more of a retail store.
Retail store. Maybe you're going to the farmers markets. Maybe somebody's using the wax to make candles. 500 colonies could do it. Average generalization, I'd say 700 or 800 colonies probably.
Okay. Expansion priorities. And I've got a bachelor's and a master's in ag econ, so that's where my mind goes.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to ask your advice. The way I see it, an outfit has got income producing units. You've got your hives, and that's where almost all the income is going to come from. And then you've got equipment and infrastructure that are necessary to run that number of colonies, but you can skimp on the equipment and the infrastructure in the short term by adding in more of your own labor. So
sweat equity.
Yeah. So if you're running a lean operation, startup operation, money short, you've got limited funds to invest, I would say you need to put money into woodenware and bees and build that up, because that cash flow will help you buy the equipment that you need.
That's absolutely correct. I knew a couple beekeepers in Oregon that went full time and borrowed all the money to do everything, got new forklifts and new trucks and all the stuff all at one time without building up to it. And both of them went bankrupt in the end because the payments were just too much for them to bear. There is this thing about sweat equity,
Yeah.
You work harder. So let's say you're moving bees to South Georgia out of Tennessee. You're going to do it by hand? You're going to do it with a hand truck? You're going to do it with a bobcat? You're going to do it with a semi-truck? I mean, there's just all these things. And then obviously at first you do it by hand, and you get like in my case, get your teenage son to help you move them. And then as soon as you have enough money to warrant buying something, then you go for it. Now, earlier I mentioned to you that I did what most people advise you not to do. I borrowed a lot of money to build my business, but the way I approached it is I always waited till an item would at least pay for itself or pay dividends before I borrowed the money to buy it. Let's use an example, that 60 frame cow and extractor in there. Obviously, when I had 200 or 300 colonies, that would have been a stupid investment. But when I got up to 700 or 800 colonies, suddenly the payments that it took to pay for that machine were warranted, because having that machine freed me up enough to where I was able to do other things. My time was becoming more valuable, so having a machine that would save time, suddenly the payments became more realistic. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. Same with a new truck. The day I went from an old 66 Ford 3/4 ton pickup to a brand new Dodge 4x4 1-ton flatbed, I waited a long time to make that transition, and as soon as I did it, I was like, okay, why did I wait so long to do this? This is saving me so much labor, so much time. I should have done this a year or two ago, but I was trying to be so frugal that I wasn't really thinking like a businessman. I was thinking like a frugal beekeeper. So there has to be...
There's got to be a balance.
There's got to be a balance there. You got to be smart. You got to be careful. I never was afraid to borrow the money for a piece of equipment if I could see clearly that equipment was going to at least pay for itself, or also dividends on top of that. I never hesitated. And it was scary at times. Like, I got 2 truck payments, a forklift payment, a land payment. How am I going to do all this? But if you're careful about it, you can approach it in that way. Just don't go too fast, too hard, too much at one time.
Well, there's a key, and I've got another quote from R.B. Manley. I love how eloquent he is.
Oh, what you just quoted.
Yeah, 1945 British English is just beautiful to read. For the establishment on a firm basis of a honey-producing business, it is necessary that there shall be two essentials, knowledge and capital, and the two must be concurrent. The bee farmer must have capital and experience at the same time. And it so often happens that by the time knowledge is accumulated, capital is dissipated. So by the time you get the knowledge, the banker's got all the money.
Yeah, that's very true.
And I think this is a key that I learned from you. By the time you were building a sizable outfit, you had a lot of beekeeping behind you.
I did, yeah. You have to grow with the bees. That's a simple statement, but it's really true. Your experience, your wisdom in beekeeping has to grow with the bee outfit. And that's partially, I mentioned earlier that I talked about those guys that borrowed a bunch of money and went bankrupt. Not the two I just mentioned. Remember earlier, it won't be in this video, I talked about those guys had 15 colonies and suddenly went to 500. They didn't have this either. They didn't know how to manage 500 colonies. They thought they did because they were doing their 15 real good, but they really didn't. Yeah, you got to grow. And so what's the magic number? I think it's pretty easy. If you're smart and you're willing to put in the work, I think you can triple every year. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to somebody that wants to go from 15 to 500, but if you do the math, that gets you to 500 pretty quick.
Yeah.
If you triple every year. That's realistic. If you're immersed in the bees and you're passionate like you and I are, we read everything we can read and go to all the meetings and try to learn everything we can, you can triple every year and you'll be just fine.
So back to the expansion priorities. Revenue, first you've got to get your cash flow or your revenue base up, and then legal, just the bare necessities. You've got to have your legalities, you've got to have your extracting, your minimum of handling, be wary of dead assets, and this is assuming limited funds to put into the business. And then you begin to fix bottlenecks that are preventing your expansion. You told me that when you were running 500 to 700 colonies, you had a Cowan Mini uncapper and two Dayton 20s, which I think they would run like 32 or 34 mediums in them.
36 mediums.
36 mediums. So you were extracting 500 colonies with two 20-frame extractors and a helper.
Yeah.
And
one of my teenage sons that I mentioned, yeah.
And then you went to the Cowan 60, and you said it immediately allowed you to go to 1,000 colonies.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what happened. In 1 year, I went from 5 to 700 to 1,000 because suddenly I had the time to do it.
Yeah. So that was a major bottleneck, and you've got to look at those bottlenecks and figure out what's going to be the biggest efficiency gain.
Well, along with the Cowan, there was more items. There was a bigger sump tank and bigger pumps and bigger tanks, so it's not just the extractor. I made an investment that year, and it took me several years to pay the payments on all that stuff. And I wasn't making more profit in those several years that I was paying those payments, but when those payments were done, suddenly the profit started to show up from that investment.
Yeah. So, economies of scale. There's a big difference in your cost per hive when you're running less than 50 colonies, and when you're running 200, and when you're running 500, and when you're running 1,000. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, and I'll talk about it maybe in a way you didn't expect, and maybe you don't even want me to go here.
Well, I'd be happy.
I think if you're going to be a serious beekeeper, you need to know how to set up a little wood shop and learn how to use it. You save so much money by at the very least, build your own lids and bottoms, and perhaps your own boxes, maybe not. And obviously building frames is a little problematic, although in the beginning I actually built my own frames and did a good job of it. I built every stitch of my equipment because I had no money. I went dumpster diving. I would literally go to a construction site and see what was laying around and see what would make, what can I make frames out of that stuff? Can I make lids out of that? And that was a big part of how I got going with absolutely zero money. And a wood shop, even if you're afraid of the saws and stuff, at least maybe get a table saw so you can make your own lids and things. That'll save you a ton of money. And let's see. I'm kind of going blank for the moment.
Well, the cost per unit,
cost per unit.
You got.
Well, that's true. If you're going to buy 1,000 boxes from Man Lake, you're going to get a much better price than if you buy 10. So your cost does get more efficient as you grow. I'm a Man Lake dealer now, so my cost has gone way down.
Yeah.
My personal cost is the same as what I buy stuff, to put in our store here. So that was a tremendous step forward for me. About 30% discount on everything I buy. So that was big. Quantities, sourcing, learn where to source and how to source. Maybe perhaps going with your friends to buy pallets of things. That's a big deal. Cayman proved that at the Hive Life. People were going in on quantities to get those special deals that they could at Hive Life, and that works. It can be problematic. You better be a good friend that you can get along with, because that can go south too. But there's a lot of ways you can save money. You got to be smart about where you're heading too. What's that old saying? Buy right or buy twice. Something like that. Yeah, there's something to be said for that too. If you know you're only going to be using something for a year or 2 or 3, and you have the wherewithal to purchase the one that you're going to step up to 3 years from now, maybe it would be smarter to bite that off and do it now. That might come in the. I was watching your videos on your honey house, and I couldn't help but wonder, what's his next step? Where's he going next? Is he going to have to build a building here? And if you had the money, which maybe you didn't, might have been a little wiser to go the building route in the first place. Maybe you don't want to grow any. Forgive me, now I'm asking you questions, but do you see yourself outgrowing those containers and all of that very quickly?
I absolutely do.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to build my hive counts, my revenue base.
Yeah.
And it's not just that. Well, I want to talk about this as well, but it's also where you sell into your markets.
You have to develop that.
Yeah,
too,
you can sell honey retail and make good money on it. You can sell honey bulk and make okay money on it. The bulk is a lot easier market to capture. You just sell into it.
Yeah, and just call Bob and sell some barrels. Yeah.
Hey Bob, you need some barrels? I can have them shipped to you.
That also gives you the ability to run more bees.
Yeah.
So even though you make more money by pouring your honey into jars and perhaps selling wholesale by the case or retail at a farmer's market, that takes time. Some guys don't want to do that. They don't want no part of that. They just say, I'm just going to run another 400 colonies and not choose to do any of that.
Well, it's not just the time in bottling it and delivering it. I'm doing all that myself. But it's finding the retail stores that work well.
Yeah.
I've sold into 12, and I currently have 5 that are reordering regularly.
Uh-huh.
And what I've found is they are reordering more and more frequently the longer that my honey's in their stores.
Well, there's something else that's going to occur with you, and I'm guessing you've thought about this already. The way it went for me was totally unpredictable. I think we worry too much about where our future sales are going to be 5 years from now. My experience, and what I see happen with most quality beekeepers, people who try to provide good service and a good product at a reasonable price, selling their honey doesn't seem to be a problem. It seems to take care of itself in time. The first 3 years I was in business in Georgia, I hit the road. I was selling at the Asheville Farmers Market, had to be there by 5 in the morning to hit the produce buyers, because by 8 o'clock it was over. I'd do that once a week. Then I'd go to Atlanta, which is a bigger market, and do the same thing. One was Tuesday, one was Thursday. By 8 o'clock I was done and headed home. The first 3 years I was doing that, and I was also hitting the road like up Maggie Valley, Cherokee, all those gift shops and tourist places. I did all of that kind of stuff for 3 years. And after 3 years, I had taken care of, I had the volume of sales that I needed for what I was doing. And on that day, I stopped making cold calls. 3 years after I went into the bee business in Georgia, I stopped seeking out other customers. We do not get on the phone or go into a business asking for more business. It has all come to us. And I think it's simple. I try to do my best. Yeah, stuff goes wrong and some customers get angry. We didn't make it on time because we had stuff happens, you know. But if you do the best you can and you try to provide a good quality at a fair price and you have a good conscience, you're not gouging, you're doing the best you can, I think that what you need will be provided for you.